The following presentation is made possible by Doodly Software and is narrated by me, Matt Milne. In the words of the great Bill O'Reilly, we're doing this live. Who decides the form and function of a city? And who decides where and how people live? Do you yourself ever get caught up in the ebb and flow of the seemingly chaotic motion of a city? When you travel, do you notice the new architecture built on top of the old? The simplicity or complexity of navigating the streets? Do you notice that certain roads seem made for cars while others seem to be made for people? Do you notice how one neighborhood or district may be culturally or ethnically distinct? What is the architecture like in these neighborhoods? What is the economic situation? Do you ever think that certain problems in the city could be solved with a subway or a new housing project? Do you believe that problems will always be innate in the city design? Particularly because cities are supposed to be messy and overly complex. If you ever thought about any of these things, Jane Jacobs is for you. Now, in order to speak about Jane Jacobs, it's a good idea to talk about Robert Moses, her nemesis. Robert Moses was an American public official who worked mainly in the New York metropolitan area and was an advocate of high modernist city planning. He emerged from the progressive movement of the 1920s. Before the war, interestingly, he built public parks and public beaches, and after, he pitched housing developments and superhighways. Now, him and Jane are both connected because in the 1930s, the utopian skyscraper city of New York fell into kind of a dystopian mess on the ground level due to the Depression. And he was the head of many proposed and completed urban renewal projects in order to combat this crisis. Now, Jane Jacobs is an American-Canadian journalist, author, activist who influenced urban studies, sociology, and economics. She lived in Greenwich Village in New York City and was a mother and wife. According to Peter Lawrence, Jane Jacobs biographer, she started writing about the city when she was 18 years old. She started as a freelance journalist and later wrote for Architectural Forum. She was forced to put her writing on hold when urban renewal projects sought to change both Washington Square Park and her own neighborhood. In The Death and Life of Great American Cities, she questioned mainstream thinking and orthodoxy. She believed that a city is not buildings, but they are about people. Slums are families and culture, and for Moses, the slums are just in the way. You cannot make an omelet without breaking a few eggs for Moses. Now, it probably wouldn't be a good podcast or a podcast that I feel like making if I didn't talk about myself for a little bit. I actually realized that I've been interested in cities for a really long time. And a matter of fact, in 2007, when I was 16 years old, I played a video game that really influenced my outlook. And upon reflection was probably the catalyst to my interest in cities, political ideology, and human nature. Bioshock is a first-person shooter that takes place in an underwater city in the 1960s, located off the coast of Iceland. And this city was created by a radical capitalist and mechanical engineer named Andrew Ryan. He was inspired by total free market capitalism, atheism, and apparently Art Deco. Ryan believed that the only place such a city could exist was under the ocean where parasites could not reach them. Unfortunately, you, the player Jack, arrive in Rapture 2 years after the starting of a civil war. The once utopian paradise for academics, artists, and intellectuals, where everyone was entitled to the sweat of their brow, had become a dystopia. The heavy class structure, unregulated markets, and human treachery destroyed the city. In the end, Ryan became the very dictatorial leader that caused him to escape underwater. Well, I wouldn't dream to compare Bioshock's underwater city of Rapture with modern urban planning. Well, at least not yet, anyways. The takeaway is that the city is not just where it is. Like, a city is about the people, the ideology, a culture. A city is a complex ecosystem, right? High modernism, the focus is on housing, industrial development, and highways, and eliminating sidewalk culture. In fact, for high modernists, the sidewalk was viewed as a leftover from a long time ago. And the idea and logic behind everything was basically around the car, and slums were seen as tumors that needed to be removed from the organism. In contrast, in response to high modernism, Jane Jacobs wrote, "Look at what we have built. Low-income projects that become worse centers of delinquency, vandalism, and general social hopelessness." And this was supposed to replace the slums. Middle-income projects which are truly marvel of dullness and regimentation. Cultural cities that are unable to support a good bookstore. Civic centers that are avoided by everyone except for bums. This is not the building of cities. This is the sacking cities. And that was cited in The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacob. Now, this criticism reminds me personally of George Carlin in his special Life Was Worth Losing from 2005. He said, "It just seems to me that only a nation of really low IQ people could take this beautiful country, or sorry, we stole this beautiful country. And have you taken a good look at it lately? It's embarrassing. Only a nation of unenlightened halfwits could have turned it into a big shopping mall. Mile after mile of mall after mall, and in between the malls are mini marts, car lots, gas stations, muffler shops, laundromats, cheap hotels, fast food joints, strip clubs, and dirty bookstores. America the Beautiful, one big transcontinental commercial cesspool." And speaking of the plainness in all the architecture, this is considered brutalist architecture. It's an architectural style that during the 19 was became prominent in the 1950s in Great Britain, and brutalist building designs are characterized by minimalist constructions that show bare building materials and structural elements over decorative design. The style commonly uses exposed concrete or brick, angular geometric shapes. If you think about London, Ontario, the courthouse downtown is a perfect example of just how brutal brutalism is and what it looks like. And in a lot of ways, you see that regimentation in a lot of housing projects in places like Chicago. Modernism moved into the mainstream of both urban renewal and American commercial architecture. Le Corbusier, a Swiss-French architecture designer, painter, urban planner, and writer, is considered the father of the high modernist thinking in urban planner. However, it is interesting to note that, as Robert A.M. Stern said in the documentary Citizen Jane, that the public housing model that we picked in the US was a misinterpretation of Le Corbusier. The towers in his 1920s plans were for offices. He never called for people to live in the high-rise towers. Jane Jacobs said that you should work with the people who make up the cities, with the fabric that already exists, instead of Robert Moses' desire to wipe the slate clean. A neighborhood needs a mix of old and new buildings that have diverse uses, while also providing accessible public spaces. In Downtown is for People, she wrote, "The best way to plan for downtown is to see how people use it today, to look for its strengths, to exploit and reinforce them. There is no logic that could be superimposed. People make it, and it is to them, not buildings, that we must fit our plans." For Jacobs, a city is a problem of organized complexity. It looks like chaos, but there is balance, an ecosystem. A city is complex because it is made up of different organisms, but there is balance. This reminded me of Street Corner Society by William Foote Whites, which is an ethnographic kind of the Italian American slum he called Cornerville in Boston's North End. Um, both those are related because they both make sense out of the chaos that we often think of a city as being chaotic and out of control. But in a lot of ways, those out of control, chaotic cities are alive cities. You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. Given all the recent talk around the world, particularly in the West, about defunding the police, we're really having a conversation now about what exactly is legitimate authority, and what it means to make a neighborhood safe. For Jacobs, it was not police officers and security guards that provided security, but busy streets. In her mind, local communities and neighborhoods acted to keep each other safe. In her words, a well used city street is apt to be a safe street. While this may make sense in both a practical and theoretical way, social psychology would disagree with her assessment. Well, some, anyways. Of course, we all know that deserted alleyways, abandoned buildings, and underwater cities suffering from civil war are dangerous because of the lack of people. After all, it is much easier to commit a crime when nobody is looking. However, some disagree with that a crowd can actually be a place of safety. In Bebe Latané and John Darley's book, The Unresponsive Bystander, Why Doesn't He Help, written in 1970, they sought to explain why crimes like abduction and murder could happen without people involving themselves. For them, the very thing that Jane proposes, add safety, large numbers of people, could actually make an individual less safe. They theorize that in situations where many bystanders are present, people tend to assume that someone else will take responsibility, that someone else has already called the police. As the number of bystanders increases, our sense of personal responsibility decreases. They conceptualize this social phenomenon as the bystander effect. And to be honest, it's kind of hard to say if the bystander effect is real or not. Studies say that it can go either way. Sometimes people only act when they have invested interest in the crime being committed. Sometimes people do just let crimes be committed when they're in a large group. It's pretty gray on that, not an absolute. Now, the last thing I would like to touch on is Jacob's assessment of post-colonialism and her assessment of the racial and economic segregation and stratification of modern cities. For Jacobs, cities are a remnant of imperialism. And it most clearly shown in the racial politics of cities, and especially in the often startling spatial outcomes of segregations of inner city racialization. Not unrelatedly, imperialism may also be reactivated in the present through various nostalgias which seek to memorialize the period of imperial might. Such trends may be marked by the self conscious elaboration of tradition, or in the preservation of historic buildings, or through the emergence of new industries of consumption which build on the past, the primitive. Precisely because cities are sites of meetings, they're also places which are saturated with possibilities for this destabilization of imperial arrangements. This may manifest through stark anti colonial activities, but also through the negotiations of identity in place, which arise through disparate settlements and hybrid cultural forms. In the Citizen Jane documentary, James Baldwin explained that urban renewal was just removing Black people from the neighborhood. To summarize, Jane Jacobs left an extremely important legacy for urbanists, writers, ethnographers, feminists, and journalists alike. She spoke truth to power and saw cities as more than just chaos and disorder. She saw the human stories and the interconnection of the cultures within a city as much more important than a city's connection to a superhighway. The lessons that Jane Jacobs taught is important to all urbanists, particularly now with global calls to build back better. Thank you for watching.